It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Orwell Lecture, and a particular pleasure to welcome such a distinguished audience, including our president, Eric Hobsbawm, who's with us today, and of course my predecessor as Master, Tim O'Shea, and particular welcome to them, but to all of you to this annual Orwell Lecture. We are very disappointed and saddened that Bernard Crick cannot be with us due to illness. As many of you will know, Bernard was the driving force in the setting up of this lecture following the publication of his biography of Orwell, and has continued to take a major interest in it through the years. So we wish him a speedy recovery. We have had a very distinguished series of lectures, usually driven by some connection either with Orwell himself or with his writings. Today we are very lucky to continue that tradition with a lecture by Andrew OHagan, who, like Orwell, combines being a successful novelist. He's published 3 novels and was named by Granta as one of the top 20 young novelists, and combines that with a serious non-fiction side, many of whose themes overlap with those which Orwell himself treated. So it's a very great pleasure to invite Andrew OHagan to deliver this year's Orwell Lecture, and under his title, The English. Andrew OHagan.
This lecture is called The English, but like all bogus titles, it has a helpful subtitle, which is Whatever Happened to the English Working Class. In the summer of 1976, a thing happened in our house that seriously challenged my notion of international relations. The English came to stay. Ours wasn't the kind of house where people came to stay. It was a council house 25 miles from Glasgow, full to the brim with noisy boys, unhappy dogs, phantom parents and football gloves. But my father had met this man on a building site in Coventry, and rashly, or one might say merrily, he asked him and his entire family to come and stay in what he now and then called Bonnie Scotland. The discussions and the tears before the visit went on for weeks. My mother immediately christened them the English, and she threatened to go on strike. I remember her saying she hadn't a clue what to feed the English, and where would the English sleep? Did they go to bed at a normal time, the English? And when they got up in the morning, did the English have cornflakes, or did they have porridge, or did they expect a banquet from Harrods, for Christ's sake? I'd like to be able to tell you that when the English turned up, all 5 of them, tumbling out of a hippie caravanette, that everything immediately went well, and peace and understanding broke out in the land of Robert Burns. But it didn't. The English colonised the house exactly as my mother had predicted. The kids jumped on the beds and laughed at the 3-bar fire. The English daddy never stopped talking in his big English accent, and the mother went straight upstairs for a bath and started smoking in the bathroom. I knew the English were different because the children were doing handstands in the hall up against my mother's wood chip. And the English mammy and daddy were always having something called naps. My 3 brothers and I sat silent on a green sofa. My father examined the Daily Record. My mother was in the kitchen, I'm sure with smelling salts, and one of the English children sang a rude song that included the word bastard. Are they Protestants? I asked my mother. Aye, they are, said my mother, and worse. Long after the English had gone south, my family discussed, for years actually, the true horror of the summer invasion. But in my antithetical note-taking way, I found myself wondering about them. Who are these exotic beasts, the English, who seem so to defy, in my mind, the meaning of exotica and beastliness when you really get down to it? They were individualists. At any rate, they weren't a family in the same way that we were. Maybe I was secretly quite pleased that the English had muddied my mother's anaglypta. Maybe I just reckoned they were freer than us. But my first experience of the English left me with the beginnings of a theory to be expounded here, that whereas the Scots and Irish were a people, a definite community, innately together and full of songs and speeches all about ourselves, the English were something else altogether. a veritable riot of individualism with no real sense of common purpose and no collective volition as a tribe. I was still thinking about the English the following summer, when the Queen's Silver Jubilee brought bunting and arguments to our street. Allegiance wasn't much of an option around our way, though the Orangemen of the town wouldn't have agreed. And soon another antithesis floated over the airwaves in the shape of an English pop group called the Sex Pistols, whom my brothers loved to death because they sang a song that included the words, "God save the Queen, she ain't no human being." We were happy to go through the motions with the ice cream and jelly on Jubilee Day, but everybody I knew thought the Queen was an English joke and a sign of our neighbours' conformity. The sound of the Sex Pistols sounded more like it. These sounded like a riot, like a political yop, an altogether different kind of Englishness. Or was the song a mistake, an aberration? The record was soon banned in any event, and we went back to imagining the English didn't really know how to behave or how to stand up for themselves or their songs. And yet there was and is a very strong notion of English arrogance, that they are naturally dominant within the British Isles. This may be bred in the bone, but the view was virulent in the 18th century, here in Britain, when the Scots and Irish were constantly lampooned in the journals and pictorials of the day. The British Museum holds a great and slightly hop-making archive of English caricatures which show the Scots and the Irish as drunken, hopeless, arse-kissing louts, which is very unfair on the Irish, I feel. Dr. Johnson baited his friend Boswell along similar lines, and the Scots got their own back in ways briskly intellectual and industrial. Yet the resentment lasted, certainly into my own childhood, and certainly beyond. My grandparents would bristle at the idea of any supposed English superiority. I remember reading a line of Milton's to myself, "Let not England forget her precedence of teaching nations how to live," and finding it intolerable, whilst also wondering whether or not reading it aloud wouldn't give my granny a heart attack. When it came to history, it gave some pleasure to know that Scots had done what I'm doing now, and had it done to us in return, risking the irritation of their neighbour by giving them an account of what they're like. David Hume, a Scot of course, did it in his History of England, which set Macaulay, another one with a Scottish Highland father, rolling with Whig counterpunches for the rest of his life. It has been among the better parts of Britishness, to my mind, the tendency of our neighbourly cultures to snoop over the garden fence and offer these thoughts with the certainty that they are one-sided with a lot left out. But let us start with the sort of thing that drove my forebears to drink. They didn't care about Dr. Johnson, or they hadn't heard of him. What they cared about was the Edwardian imperial snobbery of England that hurt the Irish and undervalued the Scots' contribution to the making of the United Kingdom. My people weren't nationalists, they were socialists, and they disliked the English habit of patrician superiority in what they otherwise considered to be a perfectly sensible union. Let's go to the source to hear the voice that roused them. Chapter 6 of Frank Fox's 1924 publication, The English. The predominant character in the British Islands is the English, and to the characters of the Irish and the Scots and the Welsh, they must generally conform if they wish to win and hold a higher place. The English character, he goes on winningly, is the most admirable in the world for dealing with savage and simple peoples. It was, I think, the keynote of the old English character to wish to be able to do anything just that the other fellow could do. What isn't cricket is generally reprobated, he finishes.